In the beginning of the story, we see a man who suddenly wakes his 6-year-old son Mark from his sleep and tells him that there's danger in the house, and they need to leave as quickly as possible. He then sends his other son, Thomas, outside, and at that moment, Mark notices that a frog figurine on a shelf suddenly comes to life. Afterward, the man takes both of his sons, rushing to the car, but just as they are about to leave, his wife, Petra, appears in front of them, begging him not to take the kids away. She tries to reassure him that no one is following them, but he doesn't listen and drives straight towards the cemetery. However, just as he glances back, his head catches fire, and he burns to death right in front of his children. 10 years have passed since that incident. Mark now goes to school, and his brother Thomas has opened a sound store. Mark is disliked by his teachers and classmates because his brother was previously expelled from the school for bullying, and Mark displays similar behavior. In his free time, Mark helps his brother Thomas at the store, where another boy named Memo also works. On Mark's birthday, Thomas gives him a family heirloom book called Chronicle, which had been in their family for generations. The book tells of a different world called the Black Tower, inhabited by dangerous creatures that work for a demon named Griffin. Griffin's ultimate goal is to rule the human world, and according to the book, only the men in their family have the power to protect humans from Griffin. Taking the book home, Mark starts reading it, thinking it's all imaginary. Yet the things and maps in the book appear very real. Looking at the bloody pictures, Mark suddenly teleports to a strange place, and a ferocious beast appears before him. Mark immediately starts running to save his life, and he falls into a pit. The beast is about to strike him with an axe when Mark screams and finds himself back in his bed. The next morning at school, a new girl named Becky joins his class, but the other kids have already poisoned her mind with stories about Mark and his brother. They tell her that Thomas slapped a teacher, which is why he was expelled, and that Mark has been undergoing mental treatment for a long time because he's haunted by that horrifying night from his childhood. But Becky is unaffected by these stories and gradually warms up to Mark. Later that evening, when Mark returns home, his mother Petra talks to him about therapy sessions. She sends him to therapy because she doesn't want him to end up like his father, but Thomas disapproves of this and takes Mark out of the house, heading toward the cemetery. Thomas is determined to reveal the truth about the Black Tower to everyone. They sneak into the upper section of the church, where their ancestors had lived, and Thomas shows Mark things that belong to their father. Among these items is an empty box that seemed to have held some kind of locket. Suddenly, Mark's finger is pricked by something sharp, and blood starts flowing. At that moment, a lid on the ground opens by itself, revealing a unique locket. Thomas tells Mark that, according to the book, only a man from their family can destroy Griffin using this locket. But as soon as Mark holds it, the stone statues in the cemetery come to life. Mark and Thomas run for their lives, but one demonic statue blocks their way. Just as it's about to attack them, an angel statue arrives to save them. A fight ensues between the two statues, allowing the brothers to hide in the church and spend the night there. When Mark wakes up the next morning, Thomas is gone. Mark thanks the angel statue before heading off in his car to look for Thomas. He goes home, opens the Chronicle book, and starts hearing strange voices telling him he needs to go to the Black Tower world to find Thomas. Mark then visits his therapist, Dr. Peters, who happens to be Becky's father. Later, he heads to his brother's store, but Thomas is nowhere to be found. Opening the Chronicle book again, Mark learns about a portal that leads to the Black Tower world, hidden in the church. However, he gets startled by a strange insect and, in a flash, finds himself in a dark, dense forest. Meanwhile, Memo arrives at the store and, not finding either Mark or Thomas there, calls Petra, who, in a panic, reports her sons missing to the police. In the dark forest, Mark eventually finds Thomas, who's thrilled because Mark has finally made it to the Black Tower world. When Mark mentions that he arrived without using any portal, Thomas realizes that Mark has the power to teleport between worlds. The next morning, Thomas wakes Mark because a group of terrifying creatures is approaching. The brothers start running to escape, but Thomas trips and is captured by the beasts. Mark teleports back to the store, where Becky and Memo are terrified upon seeing him. They demand an explanation, and Mark tells them everything about the Chronicle and the Black Tower world. But they don't believe him. To prove the truth, Mark takes them to the church. But this time, the room where he and Thomas had been doesn't exist. Frustrated, Becky and Memo leave, thinking Mark is just messing with them. That night, Mark goes to Memo's house, asking for his help to find his brother. Though skeptical, Memo accompanies Mark to the church, where they locate a door in the basement according to the instructions in the book. Mark reads the incantations, and the door opens, leaving Memo astonished. Memo realizes his eyesight has healed, and he no longer needs glasses. Overjoyed, Memo watches the door close on its own and asks Mark how to return to the real world. Mark closes his eyes and imagines going back, and he instantly teleports home. But he panics, realizing he left Memo behind in the other world. Mark tries teleporting back to the Black Tower world, but it doesn't work. At that moment, Petra sees the Chronicle book and, realizing her son is becoming like his father, locks Mark in his room in anger. Enraged, Mark bangs on the door, causing the Black Tower walls to tremble. Petra contacts Dr. Peters, who advises her to release Mark immediately. Mark escapes to the church and finds a wooden leaf with a message that Memo is nearby. Mark quickly gathers supplies from the store and goes to Becky, telling her he left Memo alone in the Black Tower world. He gives Becky the Chronicle book, asking her to give it to his mother if he doesn't return. Becky reads the book, thinking Mark is genuinely losing his mind. In the Black Tower, Mark exits the forest and plays Memo's favorite songs on a hilltop, hoping he'll hear them. The sounds attract wild creatures who begin hunting him. Meanwhile, Becky and her friends try a ritual from the book to revive a wilted flower, hoping to verify Mark's story. Back in the Black Tower, a prisoner is tortured by Griffin, who controls him and speaks through him. Mark, still searching for Memo, encounters a strange man wrapped in rags, who smears a mysterious liquid on Mark's face and hides him in a secret cave. The man removes his mask, revealing he's Memo, whose beard has grown long due to the time difference between the worlds. Together, Memo and Mark set off to rescue Thomas. They spot a convoy of prisoners, among whom Thomas is being held. But before they can help, creatures detect them, and they flee to a cliff. In the real world, Becky and her friends try to open the portal, but it doesn't work. On the cliff, Mark places his trust in his powers and, with Memo, jumps into the chasm, teleporting back to Mark's room, where Petra rushes in after hearing them. Mark calls Becky to bring the Chronicle book. In Becky's room, the wilted flower has miraculously bloomed, releasing a poisonous scorpion. The next day, Mark and Memo start planning how to save Thomas. Memo, now familiar with the Black Tower, explains that he's built a hut near a pond where the prisoner convoys often stop. Griffin's followers report that the boy who can teleport between worlds has escaped again, enraging Griffin. Becky wakes to find the flower in full bloom, narrowly escaping its sting before deciding to give the book to her father. She tells Mark, thinking his story is a lie, which makes him furious. When Dr. Peters reads the book, he advises Petra that Mark is mentally unstable, leading her to decide to admit him to a mental institution. Soon, an ambulance arrives, but Mark escapes and runs to the church, where Memo awaits. Soon, the paramedics arrived at the church, so Mark and Memo teamed up to fight them off. Suddenly, a masked man appeared and brutally beat each paramedic, leading to the death of one of them. Amid the chaos, Mark and Memo managed to escape. Moments later, Petra reached the church and saw Mark coming out with blood-stained clothes. At the same time, it's revealed that Mark and Memo have teleported to the Black Tower world. Memo took Mark to a hut he had built, while, in the real world, Dr. Peters returned home and informed Becky that Mark had taken the life of a paramedic. He firmly instructed Becky not to meet Mark again. Becky, meanwhile, lay on the floor in her room, listening to music. Just then, in the Black Tower, it began to rain, causing Memo to panic. The rainwater hitting the ground caused poisonous scorpions to emerge from the flowers, forcing Mark and Memo to run for their lives. In Becky's room, a similar scorpion attacked her, entering her mouth, but she managed to pull it out and killed it by sprinkling salt on it. In the Black Tower, the scorpions disintegrated into ashes before Memo and Mark's eyes. Realizing the truth of Mark's story, Becky retrieved the Chronicle from her father's room and took it to Petra. Back in the Black Tower, Memo and Mark came across a pond in the mountains. In the real world, when Becky's father returned home, he burned his blood-stained clothes, revealing that Dr. Peters, disguised as Mark, was the one who killed the paramedic. Meanwhile, a faceless demon appeared in Griffin's palace, reporting that he had tried his best to prevent Mark from entering the human world but failed. Mark admired Memo's hut, noticing they had a perfect vantage point to observe every convoy that passed by. Becky informed Petra of everything she knew. A detective, who was also present, found these bizarre events in the city alarming. Becky narrated the story of Mark's ancestors, only to realize she had left her bag, with the Chronicle inside, in a friend's car. Meanwhile, in the Black Tower, Mark and Memo discussed their plan by a campfire. Mark said he could sneak into the mines where the prisoners worked to find Thomas and then teleport home with him. Memo would head toward the portal's entrance in the Black Tower, and Mark would open the portal from Earth to let them out. But first, he needed to practice controlled teleportation. At that moment, a man from the Black Tower arrived at Dr. Peters' house, delivering a message that Mark was in the Black Tower. After he left, Dr. Peters collected dust from Becky's room and tasted it, allowing him to discern her day's activities. He discovered that she was at a party retrieving her bag. Meanwhile, Mark struggled to teleport, so Memo advised him to overcome his fear by focusing on a happy memory. Mark closed his eyes and imagined kissing Becky, and in that moment, he successfully teleported back to Earth. He immediately returned to Memo, who told him he had been gone for 2 days. Mark realized that teleportation required him to fully believe in and concentrate on the destination. Back on Earth, Becky found her bag in her friend's kitchen. She quickly pulled out the Chronicle book and a blooming flower. Realizing that a scorpion might emerge and attack people, she grabbed a salt shaker to ward it off. In the Black Tower, Mark heard footsteps and looked up to see his father blaming him for his death. Memo tried to reason with him, but Mark felt someone trying to enter his mind. Dr. Peters, meanwhile, reached the party where a scorpion had attacked a girl. Becky rushed to help her, but her father arrived, controlling her and ordering her to return home. Petra and the detective, also at the party, witnessed children floating and screaming in panic. Soon, the hall was emptied, revealing the terrifying scorpion-like creature. The detective tried to shoot it, but it attacked him, and Petra finally killed it with a gunshot. Dr. Peters entered, and the scorpion transformed into a bear. In the Black Tower, Mark awoke to the sound of fish, and he angrily argued with Memo, who accused him of being responsible for his father's death. Enraged, Mark brutally attacked Memo, causing the Black Tower's walls to shake. Griffin dispatched hunters to capture Mark. Memo returned to the hut with firewood, only to see Mark beating another Memo. When the real Memo touched the imposter, it disappeared, but footprints in the sand revealed its direction. Memo threw a stick in that direction, hitting the imposter, who transformed into his true form. They tied him up, threatening him with fire, and the shapeshifter confessed to being Griffin's sorcerer. He had been deceiving them by showing people what they wanted to see, as per Griffin's orders. Suddenly, they heard someone approaching. In the real world, news spread about the bear's escape from a circus cage, though only the detective and Petra knew that the real attacker had been a scorpion. The detective privately informed Petra that her husband's body was never found after he burned, and a strange figure, not a normal human, appeared before him back then. He suggested they needed to find the Chronicle to uncover the truth. Mark and Memo in the Black Tower followed the prisoners' convoy to a mine where they labored. The Hound commander arrived, announcing the failure of their mission, and was ordered to fill the mine with tar. Mark played a song to identify Thomas among the prisoners, and Thomas raised his hand in recognition. However, horned guards took him deeper into the mine. Mark suggested waiting until night, and when it arrived, Memo distracted a guard, allowing Mark to teleport in. Mark found Thomas, who revealed that the tar in the mine prevented teleportation. Thomas explained that Griffin's real goal was to reach Mark and that he was using Thomas to accomplish it. Griffin intended to use Mark's powers to enter the human world. Memo ran toward the portal with an army of horned guards chasing him, while Mark and Thomas argued over who would face Griffin. Mark used his powers, creating an opening in the cave wall with his father's special locket. The brothers escaped, but Memo was left facing the brutal guards, losing some fingers in the fight. Just then, Mark and Thomas arrived, killing the guards and rescuing Memo. Griffin, furious upon learning of their escape, rushed toward the portal. As the three brothers neared the portal, Thomas suddenly asked Mark for the locket. When Mark refused, Thomas forcibly took it. Griffin swooped down upon them. In the real world, Petra and the detective were escorting Becky out of her house, while Dr. Peters tried to prevent it. Mark regained consciousness, hearing Thomas's voice through smoke. He quickly picked up the magical locket that Thomas had thrown and realized his brother was in Griffin's grip. Petra, the detective, and Becky attempted to open the portal. Griffin tried to provoke Mark, inciting his anger for a fight. But Mark, recalling his father's advice, calmed himself and refused to engage. Once Petra opened the portal, Becky pulled Memo out with her. Seeing Griffin's furious glare, Mark struck him with the locket, injuring him. Griffin dropped Thomas, and the brothers dragged him to the portal, slamming the door on Griffin's face. The story ends here with a hint of a new season to come.